I'm Andrew Joseph Keith. I'm an artist and sculptor, and in this video I'm going to be showing you my method for making a mold for a skull. Now this is the same method that I used to mold and cast this skull. This skull is a little bit more realistic. The one that I'm going to be molding and casting is a simplified version of this skull, and I'm actually working on a project to make both of these skulls available. So if you're interested in that, watch out for that because it should be coming soon. So the primary material for this mold is silicone 1 all-purpose clear caulk, and you have to make sure that it says 100% silicone on it, and I've just found that this silicone works really well for mold making. One of the reasons that I haven't done this video earlier is because I realized that there was some footage missing, and so I'll have to supplement that with different footage. The first layer of silicone that you want to do is the brush-on layer, and for this what I recommend is just beating out a little piece of silicone and then taking a cheap brush and just brushing a thin layer of this silicone all the way around the sculpture. That's the first step to making this mold. Another optional material is some food coloring. You can add this into the silicone and it helps with the curing process. So for this simplified sculpture, I wanted to be able to attach it to a base if I wanted, and so I was going to make sure that there was a hole right at the location of the foramen magnum. So there's actually a hole in that area of the skull. But for this, I wanted to do that in case I wanted to display it on a metal pipe or something like that. And so I took some food coloring and I mixed it in with a bunch of silicone, and that food coloring helps with the curing process. So I'm able to pack this in into the hole and have the whole thing cure. This is an air dry silicone, so it's really stinky. If you're making a mold, I recommend doing it outdoors because it smells terrible. But that food coloring mixed in helps the whole thing cure so that there's no parts that aren't exposed to the air and then those won't cure. And it also helps differentiate between the layers. And notice the cone-shaped piece of clay that I put at the back of the skull. This is where I'm going to be pouring the plaster into the mold. And I have that at the back of the skull so that it's away from the details of the face. The details of the face will be on the bottom, and that will allow any air bubbles to come up away from the details of the face. Here on this cement cast of the realistic skull, you can see how some of those air bubbles kind of collected around that area where I was pouring the cement into the mold. So it could be cleaned up a little bit, but because it's on the back of the skull, not as noticeable and not as important of an area as the front. Okay, now I'm going to go and draw in the center line. This is going to separate the skull into a left and right half, and I use just a dry erase marker, and I'm looping around that hole that's in place. Now I'm going to take some aluminum wire and build up a wall of clay, and I just found that this aluminum wire just helps to give some stability to that wall of clay. As far as the type of clay, I'm just using a non-dry modeling clay. It was unbranded, it came from the Dollar Tree, and I just mixed a bunch of the colors together to get this brown. You want to use a type of clay that doesn't have any sulfur in it, and I would also avoid water-based clay for these walls because this takes a little bit longer to air dry. If you use water-based clay, that'll crack and fall apart as the mold is setting up. I'm just building up a wall that's about 1.5 inches all the way around the sculpture, and this is going to be the seam, and this wall will be the seam that separates the left and right halves of the mold. Once the wall is in place, I use a tool to clean it up a little bit, try to smooth it out. Now I'm going to add some blue food coloring to another layer of silicone because there's going to be some areas that are a little bit thicker, like behind the jaw, and then I will add that silicone to the wall of clay that I've built up. Here you can see what that looks like. Now once that's set up, I'm going to beat out a generous amount of silicone right onto that wall that I've established, and with a popsicle stick I'm going to spread out that silicone. And I want to make sure that it's spread over the entire surface of the wall and the sculpture. If there's any dry areas, it'll mess up this next part of the mold making process. So now I'm going to take this blue cloth and apply it to that wet silicone. And as I was doing it, there was an area where there was a big piece of cloth that wouldn't have had silicone underneath, so I just cut that so that I can overlay those pieces of cloth. Then I'll come in with another bead of silicone on top of this while the silicone underneath is still wet, and I will use the popsicle stick to press that silicone into that piece of cloth. And it's nice to use this colored cloth because it gets darker as the silicone soaks through the cloth, and I want to make sure that the silicone soaks all the way through, and this will give a lot of strength to the mold and keep it from tearing later on. Now I'm going to take some soapy water and my finger and just clean up the edges of the silicone. So sometimes there's little hairs or strings that come off as you're beating on the silicone or as you're using the popsicle stick to spread it around. And so I don't want those to be there. I want it to be a nice clean surface. So I just come with some soapy water in my finger and clean up any of those strings. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove that wall of clay, and this is what it should look like at this stage. You can see that thin brush on layer and the blue wall of cloth. Now what I'm going to do is create a key. So to do this, I have the silicone caulk gun at an angle, and I'm coming all the way around the sculpture. So you want to have that angle at a kind of a teardrop shape on top of the silicone, and what that does is it just allows for the next layer that we're going to build up to lock into that teardrop shape. And I've just found that this not only helps the mold lock into itself because of that teardrop shape. So this is going directly onto the wall before we do the next layer. So once that key has been established all the way around, I'm going to turn to the other side and make some keys for the plaster mother mold. And these can be a little bit simpler. They're just a drop shape piece of silicone that I'm just laying on, and this will help the silicone part of the mold lock into the mother mold that we'll make a little bit later. So here you can see on one side that bead of silicone goes all the way around on the inside part, and then on the outside it's just drops that are the keys. Now I'm going to take some scissors and clean up the mold, and at this point I'll also take an X-Acto knife and cut around that first inside layer. You don't have to do this at this stage, but I've just found it's easier to cut around it now rather than having to cut around that detail later when you're separating the mold. Next, I'm going to take some Vaseline and a paintbrush and brush it onto that wall of clay to keep it from sticking. So this next half of the mold, we don't want it to stick to that wall, but we do want it to stick to the detail layer that we can see on this side of the mold. So brushing on that Vaseline completely. And when you're brushing that on, you want to make sure that you get on the inside of that teardrop shape, that you get some Vaseline in there so that it comes out clean. Now I'm going to mix in some red food coloring with the next batch of silicone and add that into the thicker areas. And I've got some soapy water on my hand, and so I'm just using the popsicle stick to apply that silicone with the food coloring mixed in, and then I'm just going to use my hand and some soapy water to press it out. I felt like the food coloring was causing the silicone to cure a little bit faster than what I wanted, so I just decided to go with pure silicone. So here I'm adding a bead of silicone and then using my finger to press it into the details of that wall or seam that we've built up. And then once that's set up, I'm going to do the same thing that we did before and add a generous amount of silicone over the entire surface, and then add another piece of cloth to this side of the mold. Then while that's still wet, add some more silicone on top and use a popsicle stick to press that into the cloth and make sure that it soaks all the way through. And for this, you want to avoid any air bubbles. Any air bubbles will make the mold a lot weaker. After a few uses, those air bubbles will usually pop, and then the plaster or resin or whatever you're using to cast will fill in those air bubbles and it'll ruin the mold over time. So try to avoid any air bubbles between the cloth and the surface of the mold underneath. And you can kind of feel the air bubbles as you're pressing it out with the soapy water on your hand. You can feel if there's any air bubbles, and if there are, then you might have to use your hand with the soapy water and kind of push those air bubbles out. Then I'm going to do the same thing I did on the other side and add some keys for the mother mold. Once that's set up, I can grab some scissors and cut off the extra cloth. Now I'm going to take that Vaseline and add it all the way around the seam to anywhere where I see dry cloth. There were some areas where I found out that there was an air bubble that wasn't filled with silicone. So what I'm doing is I'm taking an X-Acto knife and opening up that air bubble so that I can then fill it with some silicone inside, and then I use a popsicle stick to make sure that the silicone gets all the way inside, and then I'm pressing it out with the soapy water on my finger just to fill in that air bubble so that it doesn't become a weak area later on. So there are ways to fix things later on if you make mistakes. This silicone sticks to itself really well, that's why I like it. So the next thing we're going to do is be adding the mother mold, just like you can see on this side. Hey, so due to an error on my part, I wasn't able to get the first layer of plaster, me putting the first layer of plaster on. But let me just explain that. I basically laid this down in a box with some newspaper, and then I poured some plaster over top and then put it on that surface just to get the first layer to capture all the details. It's been a day, so I'm going to wet the surface and then add another layer of plaster with some burlap on top to strengthen that. And then once I get that done, then I'll move on to this other side. But what I'm doing here is going to add a lip to the mold that'll give it some strength and also give it something to lock onto, because I like to use clamps when closing the mold. So to do this, I'm going to wet the surface just by dipping my finger in some water and flicking the surface. You can also use a spray bottle, works really well. And then I'm going to wet some pieces of burlap that I've cut into squares, get it wet with some water, and then squeeze out the water and then dip it into the plaster. And that gives me a wet piece of burlap that I can add to the surface, just as if we were making a paper mache balloon creation. And then I'll take that plaster and add it to the surface and try to smooth things out. And this will give some extra strength to that. So now that half of the mother mold is finished. So what I'm doing is building up a layer of clay so that the mother mold doesn't stick to itself in any areas. And then I'm going to mix up some plaster and do a wet coat of plaster onto this mother mold. I've also done it where I've added a piece of burlap and then done the plaster over top of that. If you do that, it's easier to disassemble the mold, but it doesn't pick up as many details on the inside of the mother mold. So I think a detail layer is helpful. Then I'll take a piece of burlap and lay it over top of that wet plaster that I've just put in place, and take some more wet plaster on top to make sure that it soaks all the way through the burlap, just like we did with the silicone and the cloth. And just like that, we want to make sure we work out any air bubbles. Now I'm going to take some more pieces of burlap dipped in plaster and go around the edge of the mold to give some strength to that edge so that it keeps it from breaking. And once that's dry, then we can take it out. Here's what it's looking like at that stage. And if there's any areas where there's drips of plaster that have come through, I'm just going to use a knife to break those to separate the two sides of the mother mold. And then I'll take a knife and kind of start to work the mother mold. And then I took the mold apart, and I didn't get footage of taking the mold apart, which is one of the most difficult things. So basically what you want to do is you want to stick the knife into the two parts of the mother mold and kind of turn to pry that mold apart all the way around, and then slowly work it by hand, just kind of pulling it apart. That's the part where it's easiest to break the mold, and so you really do have to be careful. It takes some time and patience working at it with a knife or different tools and coming around the entire edge and trying to just slowly pull it apart. Then what I'm going to do is take an X-Acto knife and clean up the mother mold, especially the inside of the key areas. There's usually like a sharp edge that can tear the silicone as you use it more and more, and so I just want to take the knife and clean up those sharp edges, carve out those sharp edges. You can even take some sandpaper and sand down the inside of this mother mold, because any sharp areas of the mother mold will tear up the silicone as you cast over and over again. Now, when I was pulling the mold apart, there were some areas where the detail layer separated from other layers of the mold. If the detail layer came off and I want to reattach that, I just add some wet silicone onto that and then place that detail layer back up exactly where it was, and then that glues it back in place. Now I'm going to add some Vaseline all the way around the seam so that when I stick these two halves of the mold together, they lock in place and it's airtight. Now you can use some clamps, or you can use some rubber bands or bungee cords to wrap around the sculpture. And then I'm going to take a container, mix up some plaster, and I want this to be fairly thin, fairly liquid. It can help to have a mixer, this mixing blade. Then I pour the plaster into place. And when you fill it about halfway up, then you want to take the mold and roll it around to make sure you work out any air bubbles, and then finish filling up the mold. And then once that's done, then we can remove the sculpture from the mold, and we'll usually have to clean up the sculpture around the seam. So here you can see a little bit of where the seam was when I cast the realistic skull in cement, but the mold making process was exactly the same. So there usually is some work cleaning up the seam. And then once this was done, I also sprayed it with some lacquer, and that just helps protect the surface, and it does give it a little bit of a sheen to it. If you're interested in sculpting, then be sure to check out the Figure Sculpting Fundamentals course or the Portrait Sculpting course. The Portrait Sculpting course is where I sculpted this as a demo to show you guys how to sculpt a life-size skull. And so if you're interested in that, definitely check out that course. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in this type of content. Hopefully you found this video helpful. Let me know if you'd like to see me cover different topics in the future. Stay creative, stay productive. I'll see you in the next one.